Well, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Table Talk Live here at theunituk.com. Now, to prefix this Constitution for a European Nation, we're just going to play a little trailer interview with a gentleman called Vladimir Bukovsky. And this video was made probably about 10 to 12 years ago now. But this will give us a prefix for the dialogue that we're about to have. We are just experiencing our usual technical difficulties, trying to get the various attendees into the show, and Peter's tackling with that. So I'll do the introductions as we go. But first of all, here is this video, the EU, the new Soviet, with Vladimir Bukovsky. Okay, so thank you, folks. I'm just going to pause that video. We're experimenting with this technology, so we hope that you were able to see that. But because I know that Peter was struggling to see that. But essentially, you can find the European Union, the new Soviet Union, on our website, theunituk.com, and you can go and see that there. And it seems incredible to me now, really, the short length of time that I've been involved with working on this project for a number of years. But I remember seeing this video back in the time and thinking to myself that it sounded somewhat disjointed with what my understanding of the European Union was. And yet, unexpectedly, I suppose, to me personally, we seem to see the economic difficulties in nations like Greece being disrupted and potentially even torn apart, just as Vladimir Bukovsky predicts. And in that video, indeed, he talks about this creation of a European nation state. Now, many of the member states, that's never ever been put forward as being the ultimate objective. Yet, if you look at our Brave New Europe series on the website, you'll find that indeed Jean Monnet, the architect of the European Union, said to the United Nations that the nations of Europe should be brought together into a single federal state, but it should be disguised as a movement by economic means. So this is the purpose of what our conversation is going to be about tonight, because there are indeed very strong moves afoot inside of the European Parliament and through the European Commission to make that move to this single federalized nation state, as spoke about and discussed in the book Democracy in a Federalized Europe, which you can download from our homepage. Now, as I speak to you now, we are still struggling with some technical difficulties and we have a couple of guests that are going to be joining us this evening, and we will try to bring them on the show. One of the difficulties with working with a live show, of course, is that when things go wrong, you've still got to run the show and you've still got to improvise. So what we're going to do now is Peter and I'm going to introduce Peter in a moment, and we'll go through our standard introductory sequence, and then we're going to talk about the topic on the table tonight, and then how we're going to explore that. And hopefully what we'll find is that Roger and Clive will join us as the show goes forward. So without further ado, let me just introduce Peter to you. So Peter Brown, good evening. Very nice to see you again. How are you today?
Hi, Rick. Very nice to see you. And good evening to everybody watching.
Fantastic. So, well, myself, Rick Timmis, and Peter Brown, we're your hosts for this evening. And what we're going to be looking at is a document called A Fundamental Law for Europe. Oh, I think that's right.
It's just fundamental law. Yeah.
It's just a fundamental law. Okay, so this basically this document is available from the ebook library. You can go and download it on our website. If you go to resources, ebook library, you'll see the document there. It's a 309-page document that's been produced by the Spinelli Group. Peter, what do we know about the Spinelli Group?
Well, basically, it was a group formed a couple of years ago by Guy Verhofstadt. He's a rabid pro-federalist, and what he's done is collect a number of like-minded people from the European Parliament and formed the Spinelli Group. Now, at the moment, they have 108 declared members of the group, plus a number that are undeclared, which constitutes a considerable proportion of the 470 EU parliamentarians. In fact, around about a quarter of them.
Okay. Now, of course, as you and I know, it is the Commission itself. So there are 28 commissioners. They are the only people that are empowered to create and generate legislation. The Parliament itself only gets to vote or to rubber stamp, as Vladimir rightly said in the opening video, or to rubber stamp the legislation that the Commission creates. So this isn't a directive or a regulatory document that we're talking about. Is this some kind of thesis or white paper, or?
Well, basically what he's doing, he's advocating the replacement of the Lisbon Treaty with a revamp of the original constitution. He's proposing that the commission be appointed, going towards a federal state with the commission as the government of that federal state. He's also proposing that the commission is reduced in size, which brings us very close to the Politburo in the movie there. At the moment, as you said, the commission is the only group allowed to propose or even allow legislation, but part of Verhofstadt's view is that that should be relaxed a bit and let the Council of Ministers actually propose legislation, but only be allowed if the Commission says so still. So it makes complete nonsense democracy.
Okay. So what we're going to do, basically, we've got two documents. I've got a summary document because I am aware indeed of the Spinelli group. In fact, there is another document on our website from the Spinelli group that from Spaghetti. I know, what a funny name, the Spinelli group. But
both Italian, aren't
they? Up on our website, there is another document related to this group. It could well be in the 1971 et al. Section, actually, because it's a supporting document that talks about the federalization of Europe and this federal nation state. And one of the reasons why we utilized that was that, as you saw in the opening movie there, and as we have demonstrated in our public talks, if you've seen any of our public talks, you'll have seen that we talk about this very surreptitious situation under the governance of Edward Heath, where Edward Heath was saying, look, there is no question of Britain's essential national sovereignty being eroded in any way, and yet the Foreign and Commonwealth Office document 1048 actually stated quite clearly that the Foreign Office said that sovereignty will be passed, legal precedents will be passed away, and we will have diminished powers. And that Spinelli document is part of that supporting material. So if you go to the 1971 et al. Section, you can see all of this documentary evidence that we're going to be talking about tonight and compile that together, including this latest document. What I'm going to do here, Peter, because I know that you've had some time to look at some of the key aspects of this document, I've got a 26-point chart here, so I'm going to try to sort of steer us through that and explore some of the points that we've got here so we can look at what these proposals are looking to do and change in detail. So I'm going to start with point 1, which talks about ever closer union. Now, we've heard that term coined before, but it says ever closer union defined as a federal union of states and citizens deriving legitimacy from popular sovereignty. What are they talking about there?
Well, basically, it is a federal Europe. They are working strictly towards that. As I said, they are going to rewrite the Lisbon Treaty. I'm just going to bring up a page here, the preambles that they intend to change. It shows on the left-hand side the existing...
Can you screen share that for us, Peter? And what I'll do is I'll present that to everyone once the screen share comes.
That's what I'm trying to do at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, and we can look at that document. Great. Here we go. And I'm going to put this on present to everyone now. Okay, magic.
Right, now, if you look at the left-hand side, this is the preamble to the Lisbon Treaty on the left-hand side. Now, it showed all the heads of state of the nations that signed it on the 13th of January 2007.
Okay.
What Verhofstadt is proposing is to scrub that and put what's on the right-hand side. We, the peoples of Europe, as opposed to the sovereign state, heads of state.
That's a great opener, isn't it?
It's a communist statement, isn't it?
Well, it seems very innocuous, doesn't it? We the peoples of Europe sounds like a wonderful opener. Yeah, great. Actually, never mind all this, titular state heads with Her Majesty this. It's we the people, we count. Of course, what is more nefarious is the fact that then goes on to say represented by the institutions and member states of the
European
Union.
Exactly right. No democracy at all. That's exactly right. No democracy at all. They've got, by getting rid of that first part of the preamble, they've got rid of the sovereign state. the left-hand side column.
Yes.
And they're
So
replacing it with the people of the federal state of Europe.
yeah.
Which is
So
the
this
right-hand
is
side.
so we now very clearly know what the agenda on the table is. This is the instantiation of a brand new integrated nation, the Federal United States of Europe. And that's what that preamble is talking about, isn't it?
Well, the document itself is 309 pages long, so we're not going to talk about that page by page here.
No.
Suffice it to say that they are heading towards a federal Europe, and they talk about increasing democracy, but they haven't. Can I suggest that we don't actually go down this list here, Rick, because I didn't compile the list, and
Okay.
it'd be difficult to follow it backwards and forwards. I'd have to be jumping backwards and forwards all the time.
All right. Okay.
Basically,
Fine.
the gist is that Verhofstadt is trying to convince us that this is a more democratic way of running things, but the Parliament will still not be allowed to propose legislation, and they're the only elected representatives. The Council of Ministers will have to be changed because there won't be any members of state, so there can't be any Council of Ministers, so that will have to be changed. But the proposal is that the Commission itself, the unelected Commission, becomes the government of this federal state. We've got no democratic checks at all on them. So basically it will become the Politburo of the United States of Europe. The Supreme Soviet will be the talking shop, which is now the Parliament. There may be an intermediate group. I don't know how they're going to do that yet. As I said, there won't be any member states to draw ministers from, so they'll have to have a second tier of unelected people.
Well, of course, now words like the Supreme Soviet and the Politburo will probably strike fear and conspiracy theory into many of our viewers that are watching this. So I'm going to play. I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a little while here, if I may, Peter, to just think about perhaps the way many people in Europe might look at this, because of course the arguments for for being able to freely travel, freely move, and have have a wide economic eurozone are all embraced by people, and many people who are disillusioned with their political parties in their member states might feel, particularly under these times of austerity and where people are having difficulties. Indeed, we saw all the cuts today with George Osborne's programme of budgetary restraint. We may well feel that actually our politicians are not representing us very well. And so why not amalgamate together and vote on members of parliament that sit in this parliament in Brussels and allow them to do the legislation and do away with the national states, so that effectively every individual person living across Europe would vote for their regional representative to represent them in parliament. Surely that's democratic, isn't it?
I say surely it's 1984, 30 years too late. Basically, we'll be told exactly what to do. It's only a matter of time that we're heading towards newspeak already with the politically correct stuff that's coming out of the EU. You were saying that's a conspiracy theory to talk about the Politburo of the Supreme Soviet, but that's what Dubrovsky has just been describing, and that guy lived in the gulags for 12 years. So he knows what he's talking about, and he can see a direct parallel between the way they're being set up at the moment.
But so people are going to find that very difficult to believe, aren't they? Because the picture that people have in their mind's eye of what the Soviet Union was and what communism is and represents is not the picture they have in their mind's eye is not what we see in the European institutions, though, is it?
Well, go and read Orwell, 1984. That perfectly describes the Soviet Union from its inception. How the fat pigs became the leaders, got all the benefits, and the poor people at the bottom lost out completely, running 5-year tractor programs and so on. It would take 3 years to get a washing machine in the Soviet Union before it broke up, because they had to queue up for them, and quite often they didn't work when they got them, but they were still pleased because they'd actually managed to get this washing machine. Do you actually want to live? Does anybody want to live under that kind of regime? I don't.
Well, but of course, one of the things that was different in the Soviet Union was the fact that the state, it was very much a fascist state, and the state was running all of the manufacturing. Basically, the public sector was very deeply involved in all of the enterprise work, whereas we don't have that scenario in Europe. Indeed, the European the illegal state aid directive expressly forbids the state to be involved in any kind of production. Hence the reason why we have the breakup of the Royal Bank of Scotland and the closure of the post offices. So, surely those things are being left to private enterprises. So that's not the same.
I seem to remember about 5-10 years ago that Air France was helped out by the French government, and there's quite a furore over that. So it's not.
Well, they're exceptions to the rule, though, aren't they?
The French are exceptions to the rule.
Yes, they are. Absolutely, they seem to be. But the point is that the system, the illegal state aid system, and the directives on legislation, and the fact that the state is diverted from getting involved in manufacturing and production and all of those aspects of things, basically lends itself to a more capitalist, consumerist, open economic state. So that's very different to the Soviet Union, isn't it?
No, not at all. I mean, both unions were plagued by incompetence of the leaders.
But that's true of the member nation states as well, isn't it?
Yeah, but we can do something about that. We can get rid of them if they're incompetent.
Right. Okay. So let's explore that a little bit more. So the problem we have here is that we cannot elect into power or out of power the commissioners or the council of ministers. We only have influence at the lower level, which is the members of the European Parliament.
Yeah, which is just a talking shop.
But does that not mean then that, for example, this Spinelli group, if the people of Europe look through this proposal, which they probably won't because there'll be more interesting reality TV shows on the TV, but if they were to read through these proposals and decide that actually we don't want that, could they not just vote these Spinelli group MEPs out and that would be that? Job done?
No, not at all. It's been estimated we've only actually got 8. Cameron keeps talking, and the CBI keep talking about staying in Europe and having a seat at the top table. That's absolute nonsense. We do not have any more than 8% of the voting rights in the European Parliament. It's been worked out that the last 54 amendments that we put forward to the European Parliament have been defeated. We haven't won a single one. So we have actually no influence at all on the Europe. It's all nonsense.
Now, why is that? Is that because the voting rights are distributed by population count or by...
No, it's because of the large groups. We've got very large groups that completely outnumber the groups that the British MEPs are in. And most of them have got opposing views. Most of them tend towards the federal state anyway. So anything that's going to interfere with the federal state will get voted out. We've got no chance. It doesn't matter whether we stay in the EU or in an EFTA, we still have no influence whatsoever with the European Parliament. Well, we have, but it's so small that it just doesn't work. 8%, that leaves 92% of votes against us, and most of the votes are going to go against us because it's in the interests of all these new Eastern European states that have come in to go towards a federal Europe. I don't know why. They've just got out of one. Why should they want to go back into another one? But they should know better than us about it. But
well, it seems to be... much of that seems to be on the back of loans. If you look at it seems to be on the back of loans and also appreciating asset values. That's what seems to entice them in the early phases. We followed, for example, the ascension of Hungary and also the ascension of Romania, and in each case there, the governments that were considering becoming part of the union were afforded considerable amounts of aid and loans that would support the changes in the economic structure, and also on the ground in the private sector. Once the private sector became aware that ascension into the EU was possible, then very often you would see an escalation in house prices, an escalation in property asset values. So that builds wealth, and I think that the countries themselves were seeing the potential benefits of wealth. The flip side of that seems to be being borne out, though, with the situation that we see unfolding in Greece,
That's what I was just about to say. That's my one-word answer to what you just said.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I recognise that counter, and it seems that there are other countries underlying with that as well. Portugal, Spain, indeed France is massively exposed to this kind of debt burden.
Yeah, Germany's got the most exposure, obviously, because the Bundesbank has been backing up the European Central Bank a lot, largely. But there's a lot of private investment from France in Greece. That's all these loans, by the way, are going to. They're going to pay back the banks. They're not going to the Greek people. But one good thing about what's happened to Greece, not from their point of view, obviously, is that we can now see just how the European Union will treat defaulters. They have absolutely no sympathy at all for them. Or they deal only with the expedient of getting their money back or keeping the European Union itself viable as an entity. It's unravelling at the seams anyway. But they
it'd be very interesting. It'd be very interesting to take that statement to the Greek Parliament, this statement on the right-hand side here, the preamble that says, "We, the peoples of Europe, represented by the institutions and member states of the European Union," and to see what their feelings are of it, having had their banks shut, having still finding themselves under capital controls, with extending austerity, greater poverty, a mass exodus of Greek people leaving Greece and Europe, indeed going to the areas of Melbourne in Australia. I don't think they'd be convinced, do you?
Not an ace. In fact, Spiros actually pointed out to them that if they did let Greece go under, that's exactly what would happen, and they know it. The best thing, in my mind, is that Greece should have made themselves bankrupt. They're going to have the pain anyway, so they might as well have the benefit of getting their own currency back and being able to rebuild their own economy. They're not going to be able to do this at the moment. No matter how much money you throw at them, all it's doing is increasing the debt, which they're never going to be able to pay. We're going to have to pay another 860 million quid, which we'll never see again, because they just can't afford to pay it back. It's pretty much like Iceland. They owed us something like 200 million, wasn't it, or 200 billion when they went bust.
Yes,
they just defaulted. But now they're prospering. Within 18 months, they were back to the black again. They had the pain, which is what Greece will have to do. But within 18 months, they'd established their economy again, and now doing extremely well. So Greece should have defaulted. It's going to happen anyway.
I tend to agree with that. I do tend to agree with that. Well, look, why don't you drop your screen share for a moment, and basically I'll just wrap that little section up for people. So one of the things that the Spinelli Group really is the key point here is that it's a fundamental change that would effectively disperse the national sovereignty and power of the national member states, and to create and instantiate a federal European Union nation with a centralized parliament and a commission and some structural reform changes, but in actual fact they seem to draw more power to the center than they do to actually disperse power out to the people, as that preamble seems to say.
Actually,
oh, okay.
One of the proposals is that any European citizen living in another country other than his own should be allowed to vote and to stand for the national parliament of that country they're living in without being a citizen, which will completely ruin democracy of a nation state, that is.
Well, yes, it would. But under this model, aren't we talking about the abolition of nation state parliaments anyway? I mean, we had this program and we talked about this in our public speaking presentations, the regionalization with the regional assemblies, which were the regional development agencies, these unelected assemblies in the southwest, middle, the various regions around, and all of Europe has been segmented and mapped like that. And so sitting in the wings, we have already these unelected regional assemblies that represent back to the MEPs, the demos, the public, elect the MEPs to go and stand in the parliament, who are fed information about the regional matters from the regional assemblies. But once again, the people are detached from that. So we're not talking about this kind of councils and district councils and shires and national parliaments. We're talking about Europe doing this properly and having properly in one context, in the sense of that all of the power and democratic control and functionality is centered around the parliaments of Brussels and Strasbourg. That's what we're saying, isn't it?
Yes, pretty much. One of the other proposals, and bearing in mind these probably won't happen all at once, but we are heading for, the intention is to go into a federal Europe, but it won't happen all at once. They're going to do it piecemeal. This document is a very long document and got several suggestions in it. One of which is that we get rid of the national chairmanships, the rotating council chairmanships. And each group then elects its own chair. So there's no control over that at all. Pretty much like the European president is elected by the Commission without any input. That will happen to the situation that is now. At least at the moment, each member state gets a rotating 6-month presidency, which will give them some leeway in guiding the way the EU is going. That will be abolished completely. There won't be any member states eventually, so there can't be, but I suspect that will be one of the first things to go.
Now, one of the things I came across when I went out and I did a number of public speaking events to various business networks and various business individuals who, in the main, people running businesses tend to, be very switched on people. But obviously they're very busy people. One of the things that came very clear to me was the notion that the European federal state was more or less the same model as the United States of America, with its president and the Senate and so on and so forth, and that these things were largely the same. What would your comment be on that, Peter?
Well, for a start, the United States of America is a group of like people. They were all immigrants to start with, but they're all English speaking. They had their own state legislature to start with, as we have now, but the European model is to get rid of the individual nation states. So in that respect, it's certainly unlike the American model. The American model is they're pretty much autonomous, actually, in their own states. They've each got a state governor who pretty much says what they're going to do. They've got their own armed forces, the National Guard for each state. It's only in federal business that they're overruled, like the Supreme Court, but their own state legislature controls most of their own legal aspects anyway. So what they're proposing here for the Europe is totally different to the United States of America. All of the American Senate and House of Representatives are all fully elected. And they both have the right to propose legislature. In Europe, that will not happen. It will still only be the Commission, a small group of men who cannot be got rid of, will tell us what to do. The whole legal system in Europe is completely wrong anyway. They're proposing this corpus juris, which basically, under English common law, which most English-speaking countries use, anything that's not expressly forbidden is legal. Under the corpus juris, anything that's not specifically allowed is illegal.
Yes, okay.
So if they haven't thought of the law yet, you can get done for it for not complying with it, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I know we had talk with Dick Erickson on one of our table talk shows talking about that very matter. And indeed, if you're watching this on the website, if you go into our video library and look at the previous table talks, you'll be able to see that. And deeper in our video library, you can find some of the presentations that Talkwell has done about that. Now, one of the things that I've talked about quite a lot was in the Constitution, the European Constitution, before it was abolished, there was this thing called the Passerelle Clause, or the Self-Amendment Clause. And under the Lisbon Treaty, that's been renamed to call it the Self-Amending Clause. But in this new document, we see in the mainstream media an awful lot of Manuel Barroso talking about treaty change, Guy Verhofstadt talking about treaty change, and so on and so forth. And that tends to make people immediately think, well, treaty change, like David Cameron would have us believe, treaty change is immediately going to trigger a referendum in the nation states. It's immediately going to trigger a response by the nation states. Now, I happened to spot when I was skip reading through this 309-page document yesterday, there was some specific mechanics of how they're proposing to do this treaty change, Peter.
Well, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to get rid of the unanimity. I can never get around that word.
Okay.
It's no longer going to require all member states to ratify treaties under this proposal. So we've got the situation where you've got QMV. Each member state, according to the number of people they have in the state, have a certain number of points. I believe that France, Germany and England have around about 70 odd, and you've got Malta right at the bottom with only one vote. But each member representative has the same input in any discussion, and
right, it
only requires, I think it's 56% of the vote, the Council of Europe or Council of Ministers to vote for a thing, and it will be carried. It requires 4 complete. I'm saying this off the top of my head now, so I'm not time since I read it. It requires 4 member states to actually introduce a blocking motion, but basically it's stitched up. If they want to go into a federal Europe, they can bring us into it, legally, that is, unless we get out.
Yes.
They're talking about basically what Cameron's red line was, one of them was that there wouldn't be a 2-tier Europe with the non-Euro countries being pushed out to the sidelines. This document actually says that they will all be brought into Europe, the Euro coin. So it's just getting more and more as a statement of Britain becoming part of a federal Europe. And unless we get out, we are going to get drawn into it. No two ways about it.
Yes, I mean, I tend to agree with that statement. Well, of course I would, wouldn't I? That's why I'm involved in this kind of in what we do here at the Unit UK and getting the news out and the information out, of course. And that's the key factor here. I think the key importance for people watching this video is that the information that we seem to be being given in the mainstream media, so through, for example, channels like the BBC and the press and so on and so forth, paints a picture. However, what we see here at the Unit UK is that we don't seem to be able to ratify that picture that the media is painting for us with the documentation and the legal structures that are being built and constructed inside of Europe. And this isn't just one or two articles or the odd white paper. This is carte blanche throughout treaties, throughout dossiers, throughout, in fact, even, the Human Rights Act, we found some quite astonishing facts in there that you can read about in our book on democracy in a federalized Europe. And that's the thing that we really need to explore. And we're trying to gather that information on the website, make it available for you, and to look at that in these kinds of debates. So moving from there, then, we now know that the Spinelli Group and this white paper have created the mechanism to deliver the treaty change. They're creating the political constructs that will alter the balance, making it very difficult to oppose the direction that this is going to travel in. Now, of course, there's going to reach a point, Peter, when the truth will out, if you like, where the people suddenly realize that, hang on a minute, this isn't quite the picture that I was looking for. And I'm going to look at some of those things for a moment. I mean, one of the things it points out here in this point is that it talks about the ending of opt-outs in justice and home affairs. So now that highlights this difference between habeas corpus, corpus juris, but also in home affairs. So that means that what does that mean for us on the ground? What are we going to lose when that takes
Well, it's not
place?
particularly relevant right now, is it? Because the government's already opted in to the ones they opted out of. The 150-odd clauses, most of them were redundant, so they just ignored those. But the ones that they opted back in last December, which included the European arrest warrant, has already occurred. So I believe there's only two countries at the time, us and one other, I can't remember what it is now, that had the opt-out clause of the Lisbon Treaty. So it's a moot point now. We're back in.
Yeah. So that means for us then, if we accept, which I think we do here, that the European judicial system has primacy or precedence, but it has legal primacy over the nation member states, then whilst we might think that we have a habeas corpus system in our national judiciary, in actual fact, we don't. We are actually subject to the powers of the European justice system, which has primacy over UK law. And indeed, we can see many examples of that through the use of the European arrest warrant. And of course, let's just drive back to a point in your book, Democracy in a Federalized Europe, because let's just tell us a little bit about Eurogend 4 and what they're all about, Peter.
Yeah, Eurogend 4 is the European Gendarmerie Force. On exactly the same day that the Lisbon Treaty was signed, on the 13th of December 2007, there was a little-known treaty being discussed in Velsen, which actually 6 countries actually agreed to form this European Gendarmerie Force, which is a supranational police force across the whole of Europe. Their sole purpose is they're trained only for riot control, which is very worrying indeed, because we don't tend to have riots unless someone's really upset us. And you can see them in Greece right now. We've seen them in Spain. We've seen them in Portugal. It's likely to happen as we force more and more into a more restrictive regime, which is what the Federate Europe will be. Now, this force now has grown from those 6 countries to, they now total more than 3,000 personnel, and they are completely paramilitary. They've got tanks, they've got helicopters. They are similar to 3 or 4 battalions of regular infantry, except they're trained specifically for controlling crowds. They, under the Article 222 of the Lisbon Treaty, which was only given words in July last year, some 8 years after the treaty was signed, apparently the signatories agreed they will delay the wording of Article 222 to a later date. That happened, as I said, on 26th of July last year. And there was already a commitment for mutual support between the member countries, but this lays it out in black and white that each member country will apply all of their resources if called upon. Part of the thing that they say, and it is to guard against armed terrorism, but knowing the European Union, they're very loosely worded, virtually all of their documents, and they will put whatever interpretation they like on it. And the riots we had a couple of years ago, it could be construed that someone picking up a crowd control barrier and throwing it at the police is an armed terrorist. Now, these people cannot come into the country unless invited by the government. Now, that only needs to be the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary in our case. Once they're here, they cannot be got rid of. Not even an Act of Parliament can get rid of them. They're here purely under the control of the Commission and the High Representative. Our government doesn't get a look in. Now, last year, Dominic Raab, a Conservative MP, asked the Home Office in a written question, do the Home Office ever envisage this article being invoked to bring foreign troops in? And Keith Brokenshaw replied in Parliament, yes, of course, if circumstances warranted it. Now that is high treason, to bring foreign troops in to control British people. But it's the way the EU is going at the moment. They want to tie the whole thing up.
Well, that's certainly going to tie in with what David Cameron was just talking about in his statement about, very recently about digital encryption and basically the Snoopers Charter that's been reintroduced. This is all about this idea of combating terrorism, and as we see more and more activism taking place by ISIS and other terrorist groups, not just them, but any kind of terror activity, and that the proposed solution to that seems to be to just take away the general populace's liberty and freedom, just more state control, more legislation, less freedom, and that will tackle the problem of terrorism. Well, that didn't work with the IRA in Ireland, and it won't work now, will it?
No, I mean, don't forget Europol, which has started off to stop bank fraud, but has now sort of developed into a sort of European FBI. Every single member of Europol has got complete immunity, legal immunity to anything that they do for life whilst carrying out the duty. They've got diplomatic passports, every one of them, and virtually every European treaty, if you care to look, gives that same legal immunity to anybody working in Europe for life. The only way they can be brought to book is if their bosses say, right, he's done something illegal, nick him. But there's no one that can touch the bosses. And it occurs to me, something like the ESM, European Stability Mechanism. Now, this is all to do with money. So they've got complete immunity if they start to defraud. I mean, we already know that they're completely incompetent. The fact that they haven't signed off their accounts for almost 20 years. It doesn't take a great stretch of imagination to think that someone's going to rip them off. There's already fraud is rife in Europe. No one knows exactly how much, but it's something like 600 billion. Sorry, million in the last 10 years.
I think Ashley Moat's got some ideas of how much. Ashley Moat. Is it Olaf, isn't it? The investigatory body. They just locked him up. They sent him to prison for defrauding the EU for a whole bunch of cash. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It is rife, and but obviously, once again, the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, now that's been called into book, and a derivative of it, the European Stability and Finance Mechanism, which is a way to work around the member states that didn't join the ESM, is being utilised to fund these bailouts in Greece. And if you put ESM into our website, in the search panel, you'll find the videos on that'll explain to you how that construct of the European Stability Mechanism works, how the national member states are completely in hock to the financial burdens that it imposes upon them, and how all of that institution basks in the luxury of absolute legal immunity. So you can find more information there. But on this topic of finance and economics, that brings me to a few points that I was just looking here on this headline proposals that we can look at. So, I mean, basically it's talking about a European tax revenue that will be used to finance EU spending. They want to add additional budget, more money for the Eurozone, essentially. They want to have a more common economic policy, which is focused on sustainable growth. And finally, fiscal solidarity and complete fiscal discipline.
Well,
sorry.
Go ahead. The big mistake they made with Greece, wasn't it? I think they gambled. They put the cart before the horse, because you cannot possibly have a single currency without taxation and fiscal policy under the same roof. They knew that Greece couldn't comply with it, so I think they gambled that Greece would in fact default, but they were hoping that the emergency that was a result of that would enable them to pull Europe into tighter controls. It hasn't worked that way. It's blown up in their faces to a considerable extent, but I believe that's what was their original intention, because no banker would be stupid enough, I mean, especially with the benefit of the ERM some years before, they could see what was going to happen when disparate currencies try to join together. So that is the only possible ulterior motive I think they could have had, that they were hoping to create a national emergency within Europe to draw everybody into tax and fiscal responsibility under the European Central Bank. That's the only way it could possibly work. They're talking about in this document also a limited amount of pooling of debt. Basically what you were just saying a few minutes ago. Cameron made the big hoo-ha about coming back saying that I've got us out of paying for the Eurofund. But in fact, they turned around and said, "Oh, we were joking. That was only talk. There's no legal basis for that. You're going to have to pay us anyway." That pretty much would. The pooling could only work again once they've achieved their aim of bringing down the common denominator of wages, which is they're doing by flooding the richer countries with the poorer countries. They're trying to bring down this cost of labour, of a cheap, compliant workforce. That once that is achieved, they can then start talking about pooling national debts, because it's everyone will be the same, so they won't be losing any money because they'd already lost it, basically.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I think we should. I always tend to err on the side of trying not to ascribe things to conspiracy, which can be laid at the door of incompetence, and I do tend to think that there are two factors at play here. There's a benefit factor, which we'll talk about in a second, and there's an incompetence factor. One of the things that seems to have gone awry since basically since the Keynesian economic theory had been put into practice, this Keynesian model for economics, it doesn't stack up. We've got all of these kind of like almost fixed invariable parameters that are put into the economic models, and they just don't hold water. And what we're seeing is that this ever expansionist consumerism, this ever increasing growth, this infinite growth model that's required by the Keynesian model doesn't work. Unfortunately, many of the advisors to the political institutions all come out of various center of economics, various universities and institutions that all preach and practice the Keynesian model. So the advice that the ministers are getting when they talked about this idea is that this is going to work. Now, as you rightly said, no self-respecting banker is going to sit there knowing the the bond market, stock market, investment market model. It's going to sit there and say to himself, this model is going to work. However, he has a distinct advantage in not saying anything, because the banks, since they removed the kind of Glass-Steagall legislation and we had all of the relaxing of the regulations, meant that the banks could begin speculating, investing with depositors' money. One of the things that they were able to do was to speculate on the interplay between nation member states' bonds. And so having national member states with the ability to issue their own bonds to basically grow their own sovereign debt outside of the control of a central bank, that's great news for the banks and great news for the investment corporations. So there's an incentive for them to continue that and to not advise against it until it reaches a point of unsupportable collapse, which is where we're at the moment. And of course, the policymakers never saw that coming because their education never considers that as a factor in the model. So I tend to think that it was less deliberate and more just complete and utter incompetence.
Well, it's a bit like a gambling addict, isn't it? He keeps going for that one bet that will pay for all his losses.
Well, they're doing exactly that now. That's precisely what they've just done with Greece. And the common man, people like you and I, we're all sitting there looking at this and going,
not so much in the common, mate.
Okay, but you know, the ordinary plebeians on the ground, if you like, we're looking at this and saying, how can you possibly pay? You know, it's like taking one credit card that's got a 7% interest and paying it off with another credit card that's carrying 9% interest and going, oh, there we go, it's all fixed now. That's going to work.
The whole thing was always from the start. It's another Ponzi scheme.
Absolutely, it is. It's not going to stack up. But under this white paper, the Spinelli Group's thinking is, let's have more of the same. Let's have more centralization. Let's wrap it all up in a centralized bank. Let's expand the debt. Let's now issue euro bonds and assimilate the thing into the greater whole. This white paper has learnt nothing about the new economic paradigm. So,
well, what it has done, it has learned something. It's learned that it can't come in hard with a federal Europe. So what it's done, I mean, this crib sheet that I downloaded from a site has got 26 points on it.
Yes.
What they're going to do is do it piecemeal. Basically, they're going to bring this bit there and then this bit over there until eventually we find ourselves in the hole. I mean, I don't mean that. I mean a hole with a W, not a hole that you fall into, although that's going to happen anyway.
I think they're synonymous in this context, aren't they?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there is a gradual erosion. As I said before, I do not believe they'll try and bring them all in one go. There will be a gradual erosion of any checks against the EU. I mean, this one about the rotating council presidency, for instance, to me, that's a big no-no. It may be superfluous when and if we become a federal Europe, because we won't have any nation states. But it is the only time that a national state can actually make some input into what's going on in the Europe. It at least sets the agenda. It may not be able to influence the agenda, but it at least sets it, which is quite a big benefit. But if that's taken away, the nation states will not have any kind of input like that at all. It will all be down to more or less permanent members of the commission, and I suspect there'll be a second house which will be unelected as well, to replace the Council of Ministers, to keep the pyramid going, basically. And they will be unelected. There's no indication on this document that the second chamber will be elected from Parliament. That would be slightly mitigating, but not sufficient, because the Parliament is not democratic in its first place. We've got to wait 5 years to get rid of anyone. We can't even get rid of a single member of the European Parliament because it's done on a sliding party block. We don't elect. We may in theory elect a single person to be our MEP, but should he resign, the party takes over and nominates who our new MEP. We won't have a by-election or anything. They just move the slot up a bit and get the next one in line. I believe that happened one in the West Country somewhere, didn't they? Someone actually resigned as MEP, and they just moved the next one up.
Yeah, indeed. In actual fact, that was one. In fact, in the West Country, it was our very own Trevor Coleman. So Trevor Coleman basically took over the place of a man who, God rest his soul, is now deceased, Graham Booth. Graham Booth had been elected into office as the MEP for the Southwest region for quite a long period of time, but due to ill health, found himself having to resign. And when he resigned, the number 2 candidate basically stepped into his place. So there was no by-election at that time. So Trevor took over halfway through the parliamentary session. And was the representative for the Southwest, and then was re-elected for another 4-year period off the back of that at that time. So you're absolutely right. That's quite right.
So basically there's no comeback at all for the electorate, is there, on the whole of the European construct?
Unfortunately not, and I think that was the next message I was going to leap to. I mean, essentially, we've been broadcast live now for an hour, so what we're going to do is I'm going to bring this to a close with some wrap-up messages. And I think one of the important measures to take away here is that the information that most people are seeing via the mainstream media and the press and so on and so forth is not representing the true moves of what's really happening in Europe. Now, neither Peter or I, we don't want you to take our word for this. You've heard us talking about the potential issues here. Use the website. It's a resource where you can find all of this information. You'll find the Parliament's own documents, our own Foreign and Commonwealth documents, all of this documentation for you to look at. And it's important that you look at it and that you direct people to it, because it's important to understand how we're governed. It's very easy to feel disenfranchised and disappointed with the political system that we have right now, and to turn our backs away from it. But in doing so, we're going to get something which is far more restrictive, has far more control, and leaves you with much less liberty. So that would be my comments. What are your sort of parting comments to the audience on this situation, Peter?
Well, you know my feelings about the EU, obviously. There's a big movement now to get the no vote moving. And there seems to be a predominance of this Flexit thing from Richard North. He seems to have all the media resources and he's becoming very dominant. But personally, I do not believe that Britain would be better off in any shape or form within the EU, whether it be an EFTA or an EEA agreement. We will still be subject to the immigration laws and the other three freedoms are actually beneficial to us, but the freedom of movement of labour is certainly not. They're talking, I mean, with these refugees coming in now, there's 180,000 came in last year, and they're talking about taking 2 years to shift 40,000. Whatever happened to the other 160,000? So did I say it's 200,000? So they've been put into limbo, have they? But no, I am very much for I can't think of the name now. Global Britain, that's the biggest group. This is the group being set up by the businessmen. And they advocate the fourth option, which is to go completely alone. And we've got to be very careful that the outside of the argument is not completely swamped by Richard North and the EFTA Flexit thing, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
I think we'll be going out of the frying pan into the fire.
Okay. Well, okay. So, obviously for our audience out there, just a little bits of housekeeping notes. As you know, here at the Unit UK, we're a voluntary organisation. We're going through some internal changes at the moment, but we're clearly treading on a number of people's toes. Thank you to all of the people that are out there that have been supporting us with your donations via PayPal. We absolutely could not survive without that support that you've been giving us, because we would not be able to provide the infrastructure and the servers. As you know, we were attacked by some Eastern European hackers that decided to take umbrage with what we were doing on the site for whatever reason, and took the site down for a number of days. And that, well, for a couple of days, that gave me some very interesting challenges trying to recover that. And it's left us with some infrastructural problems too. So you need to bear with us a little bit, but we are continuing to fight the good fight and to remain a voice out there. We're going to be making some changes into September, and we're going to be updating a few things and improving some of our infrastructure. So do spend your time visiting the website, stay up to date with the news there, subscribe to our RSS feeds. That will give you the latest news as it gets posted up to the website. And of course, keep an eye out for these Table Talk shows, which we're going to be continuing. We'll bring you another one soon in due course. So I'm just going to say thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure talking about this topic and sharing this information with you, the audience. I'm Rick Timmis. It's goodbye and farewell from me, and over to you for your final comments, Peter.
Yeah, goodbye, folks. I hope we haven't bored you too much. It's a shame that the other two guests couldn't arrive, because Roger Wright Morris is actually a legal person, so he could have explained it a lot better than us two could. Clive Taylor-Scholl is probably going to become a regular on these talks. He, again, had work commitments and couldn't make it, but it would have opened the program up a bit more. So I hope that we haven't bored you too much. But I look forward to seeing you all again at the next Table Talk.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. So to all our audience out there and those watching live, good night and God bless. I'm Rick Timmis. I'll see you soon.